Well, we live in an increasingly datafied, but also an increasingly automatized society. So we live in a society where, think about, for example, the urban space, more and more of our interaction with the space itself, or also with other people, are mediated by technology. Think, for example, about the smart city, which is, no longer news, but it is more and more all around us, from intelligence or supposedly intelligence way of managing, for example, traffic infrastructure or the movement of people, to those creepy marketing billboards that adjust to our emotions in order, of course, to sell us products. So we are surrounded, we are literally enveloped by a variety of different technologies that we no longer can ignore. One of the creepiest, I guess, technologies that we see popping up left and right in the urban space, so in the public square, in schools, in airports, in public transport infrastructure, but also in private situations like public housing, is facial recognition technology. I mentioned that because it is something that I'm studying specifically these 5 months, where I'm lucky enough to be a fellow at a sister organization to the one where we are today. I'm at the Netherlands Institute of Advanced Studies, looking precisely at the impact of facial recognition technology on citizenship, and at how and whether, in fact, citizens and people are resisting the adoption of this technology, the rollout of this technology in public space. What does facial recognition technology do, and why should we worry about that? This is actually a picture, it's a screenshot from a documentary that came out a few years ago. It's called Coded Bias. If you have not had the chance to see it yet, spend a good hour and a half of your life getting scared, but I think it's quite worth the watch. And it is on Netflix as well at the moment. And among the various technologies that are analyzed is the implementation of facial recognition technology to enter social housing in London. So how does it work? Here you see an example of actually one of the real citizens. That is then, this is the informations that are captured through the analysis of her face. Well, not really captured through the analysis of their face, but matching existing information and data set and the identification that is empowered by facial recognition technology. So what does facial recognition technology do? It's just an example of the many technologies that I'm going to talk about today, but takes a real-time picture of our facial features. In fact, much more. There's also emotion oriented recognition. There is a recognition of our way of moving in the space, so our way of walking. So in the assumption that all of this is fairly unique to an individual, and it's not actually a real-time picture like a picture that a phone would take, but it is. It takes. You can see it here in the screen. It measures distances among some specific points in someone's face. It's identifies people similarly to fingerprints. And then this information, this virtual picture of ourselves, is matched with existing information. How is it used in the case of this situation here with this lady? It is used to enter public housing, social council, so regulated rent housing, which is usually for impoverished and populations and people at the margins. And what are also often the most policed, also often the ones where draconian technologies, surveillance technologies are tried out first to see whether they work, in the assumption that these people have less ability to articulate dissent or less sense of, unfortunately, their entitlement to human rights. And you can see that basically this woman, by being identified in real time, she was matched with existing information about her. And some of her infractions recorded in the system were handing out flyers in the building where she lives, having a doormat in the hallway. So you can see something that has to do with maybe expressing political dissent of opinion, but also something very trivial like, doormat, and probably there are rules around against that, and a very severe recycling violation. And this is just an example of how technology is increasingly used to monitor and manage people. What is creepy about facial recognition technology? So the camera. Okay, sorry. Oh, this is very loud. Is it too loud for you in the room? Okay. Yeah, so technology is increasingly used to monitor and manage people. This, if you want to think about this technology in old life terms, in pre-facial recognition technology terms, if you want, it's like walking around town with your open passport on your forehead. Now, a problem that is associated with this is that the information that are available about any of us, and if we have ever been on any social media with our face, whether we have posted it ourselves or some friends and family or someone else has done it for us, we are in one or more data sets. And but sometimes the identification, so the accuracy rate of this technology is particularly low. So then you might be receive a fine for a recycling violation that you actually have not committed yourself. This, as you can imagine, is not a big drama, but there are much worse case scenario. Technology is not only used to monitor, people, but also to manage people's movement, and by extension also to make and unmake the polity. This is another example that has become familiar over the last few years. It is a picture that is basically the background of thermal camera. Thermal cameras, you might remember them. They became very popular in the COVID times. They're still implementing in many places. I remember not long ago, actually, in COVID times, going to a congress, and you had to go through to enter the amphitheater. You had to go through this camera that would measure your temperature. And it would immediately stop you in a way. So there would be also decision-making associated with it. So if you identify that someone was running a temperature, you might be asked, you are actually asked in that precise instance to leave the room or not to enter the premises. So it might sound like, anyway, a desirable case scenario. I don't want to sit next to someone who might be sick, but it has a number of other implications, also the use of this technology, which is often associated also with facial recognition software. But it's a great example of how technology can be used to decide whether you belong to a community, maybe in a given point in time, but to keep you out or allow you in. Another similar example that I'm often very wary of talking about, in fact, there's no slide about it, is the vaccination or immunity certification of the passport, the green pass. I don't know whether you had it in Denmark, but a QR code that would be the proof, so would contain information about your vaccination or recovery from COVID status. And so I'm pro-vaccination. I'm not saying that I don't like that, but I always found this form of identity verification and the setup of an infrastructure of that kind for identity verification and data collection to be creepy, because potentially exposing citizens and people participating into this these dynamics, basically all of us, if you want to get access to certain places, including in some countries like Italy, your workplace. So it exposes people to other secondary or third party or missions creep uses of the data. But this is another example of how technology can be used to allow you access or keep you out, therefore making and unmaking the polity. And then, to fast forward to another type of technology, which is very popular these days, it's a form of artificial intelligence, more specifically the large language model, of which ChatGPT and all its siblings are a good example. Now, what are these type of systems where they operate in the realm of machine learning, and they operate also, and they get trained on data, they feed themselves on data that we ourselves serve to them. So they are being trained also as we speak, but essentially they are powerful knowledge machines that in a way can be seen as altering the conditions under which we make sense of the world and act upon it, maybe. Yeah, we're talking about social movements. So what happens when I get my information through an interaction, through ChatGPT. So, in similar manner in which I would, for example, I don't know, go to Wikipedia and ask Wikipedia, hey, not ask really, but like, for example, gather information on Wikipedia about, let's say, Shell as a company. And, trust that information, which is already anyway problematic in itself, if you know how Wikipedia works, but we've all, been there, done that. What happens when we use essentially as a knowledge machine, as our source of information, something like ChatGPT? It's an open question. This morning I was actually listening, thanks to Zoom, I was listening to Emiliano from the bus, taking me from the airport to here. They work very, very well. And Emiliano already gave you a hint of the fact that things are changing big time, right? He talked about, other sort of complementary forms of, types of technologies and how are they used by movements. But essentially also he pointed to the fact that we are facing an enormous paradigm shift. And paradigm shifts is something that, they're very hard to grasp for us, little human beings living, if you're lucky, for 80, 100 years on this planet. So paradigm shifts are of such, are so powerful, but also so big and so hard to grasp that usually they are more easily interpreted by the people that come after, right? So in sort of historical terms. But really, we should think about the process of datification, which is, the process of turning a lot of information into data that can be traded and used to make sense of a reality. But also the process of automation of society. The advance of intelligent systems, that is, artificial intelligence in society, really alters our relationship to and our understanding of the world. And, and the process also reconstitutes us. Then I put a picture of a scholar that has been particularly influential when I was much younger. And he didn't talk about ChatGPT. The guy is long dead. I don't know whether you're familiar with his face, but in fact, he's actually not famous for his looks, but for his writings. Is Marshall McLuhan, a critical media theorist from the University of Toronto, who was one of the first, at least in my recollection, for me, was the one who revealed to me the importance of the infrastructure, if you want, although he didn't call it infrastructure, the importance of the materiality of the medium into shaping our worldview. So without really even attempting to make justice to his really rich, very beautiful, granular theories of media in the world, I'm going to just to give you a sense of what his reasoning was. So, for example, he lived in a time in which, the media of reference were radio and television. There were also the very early days of television. And if you remember a little bit the history of these two types of medium, they are very much intertwined with, some very important political changes, in the Western world, at least in Europe, with the advent of fascism and Nazism. So with the, very scary developments of masses that ran after essentially charismatic or variously charismatic leaders, also with the assistance of this new mass media. And so this is more or less, the very different ecosystem, media ecosystem, technological ecosystem where Marshall McLuhan lived. So very different from today, of course. But it was very interesting in trying to, for example, try to understand what television does to us, what radio does to us. And he had a very, very good story about, for example, how television, so medium are an extension of the senses. So we are human beings, so we experience the world through our senses. We have 5, right? We have the sight, we have the smell, and all of that. Television, for example, augments the sense of sight, so allows us to see further. So for like my grandmother, who never had the chance to, travel to whatever funky faraway country to see some animal that she never had the chance to see in Europe, seeing on TV was a completely different experience than seeing it painted, right, or pictured. So this is the type of reasoning that Marshall McLuhan does. So the augment, so the fact that media technology augment our senses. So in the same way, we can really follow his reasoning and think about what something like facial recognition technology, like various machines of identification, like social media platforms, or ChatGPT and his sibling do to us in the way of reconstituting us as human beings, and also shaping really the way we relate and understand and make sense of the world. Now, we know very well that sense making is actually one of the very crucial elements in a way of reclaiming political agency, which is what social media, social movements, are after. So then you understand how technology that plays a part in that is important for scholars of social movements. But now, thinking about the paradigm shift, I would like to invite you to think in really broad strokes of long-term historical developments, similar in the scope to what you see pictured here. So, these are two historical representations of the Earth, of the planet we live in. So the pre and the post-Copernican. So where essentially the relation with, or the centrality, let's say, of man, the centrality of the planet in the depiction of university change, of the universe, changed dramatically. And you might remember that back then there were many agents, many entities that rejected or resisted this change in vision, the change in perspective, because he also had to do, for example, he had consequences for the role of God, for the positioning of human being versus God. So if you're no longer the center of the universe, spent too much time at university. It really, changes also the role of the church. So this is when I talk about paradigm shift, I refer to these long-term ontological and epistemological changes that we are just able to see the start of now. And probably we are not going to be able to see what comes next. I mean, like in terms of the real long-term consequences of all of this, simply because it's going to go past our lifetime. At the same time, it's also true that with the difference, the way knowledge is circulated around that time is very different from the way knowledge circulates today. So we can also imagine that now it is true, we live through a paradigm change, which is massive. We probably indeed do not appreciate all the consequences of it in real time. We need to have also an historical look, which is impossible for us. But it's also true that technological transformation goes so fast and knowledge circulates so quickly that there's some differences anyway to this time. So we might still be able to see some of it today. So in this sort of very sometimes scary, but also at the same time, I didn't give you an example of that, empowering possibilities offered by technology. Then the question is, how does technological transformation contribute to, if you want, reformat, to use language that anyway comes from computing, activism and political participation? And then by extension, also the very same notion of liberal democracy, the relation between the state and the citizens, the social contract that regulates the relation between the state and the citizen in a welfare state, and so on and so forth. Now, I'm not really gonna try to solve it all today. I mean, I'm not gonna tell you, because I have no clue about how. I mean, I have some hints, some ideas, but I don't have definitely a full-fledged theory about how liberal democracies change under the pressure of technological transformation, although I'm trying to do some thinking along those lines. But I would like to focus specifically on then social movements, and trying to do a little bit of conceptual thinking about our discipline. And by our discipline, I would like to refer to social movement studies. So I'm a political sociologist trained in social movement studies. That's where I also did my PhD. Then, life takes in different directions. I always had the fascination for technology. So I've always been studying what movements do with technology, from analog technology to much more recent stuff. And I ended up working in a media studies department. And now, as Christina said, my job title is very obscure, in fact, but flexible also because obscure, and it is critical data studies, whatever that means. I wanted technology and social change, but I was not allowed to by my department. So I went with something that anyway was a bit of like it's not as beautiful as Emiliano's title, actually. I'm very jealous of his title, but I still can do with it. But the reason why I mention is because I really try to marry these two disciplines, which are both quite flexible, probably one more than the other. I'm talking about critical data studies because it's, it's a collector of a lot of different things. It's very interdisciplinary. Also sociological, but not exclusively sociological. And I'm trying to, drawing from these two line of thinkings, trying to, propose some rereading, if you want, of some core concepts of social movement studies. Now, I'm not going to solve it all. And we are just going to hint, and I say we because this is something I'm doing also with Davide Beraldo, also from the University of Amsterdam, who is not here today. So we are thinking about these things together. And it's, in any case, as I mentioned, something that requires the collective creativity and intelligence of everyone, not just of two people. But I mentioned that one of my, ultimate interest is also the transformation of democracy. So I'm going to just give you a hint about that because it's a good starting point about rethinking, core concept of social movement studies. And my core hypothesis is that datification and automation really accelerate the crisis of liberal democracy. We already know, and I'm not going to do now, go down the road of, the political science work on the crisis of liberal democracy, declining voter turnout, rise of populism, and all of that. Yes, that's all very true. There's ample research on that, amazing material coming from people that are much better qualified than I am to work on that. But I would like to also add 3 elements as to why we should worry about this crisis also in relation to technology transformation and datification and automation in particular. The first is the fact that when we talk about datification and automation, we have the private sector that plays an increasingly important role. So, and also in the business of the state. Also in the welfare state, for example, also in the running of basic decision-making when it comes to, do you have the right as a poor family to receive child subsidies, for example, or not? So we see more and more algorithms percolating into the system. And these algorithms are rarely put together, if managed and controlled, operated, if you want, by the state itself, because the state usually doesn't have the capacity to do so. So what we have is that more and more the private sector, the industry, the tech industry mediates the relation between the citizens and the state. Second, something that you probably has already noticed that I kind of like to think about how bad all of this is, although I also sometimes look at how positive aspects or positive dynamics can come out of it. Surveillance and the monitoring of the population and people's movement that ultimately alter the so-called social contract, but also alter really the trust that citizens might have on the state. And here I have plenty of examples also from my country of adoption, the Netherlands, of how, if the state uses flawed algorithms. Recently, it was there's been actually 5 cases recently that have come under public purview of algorithms that are created by humans and that therefore embody the same prejudices of the humans that, for example, discriminated certain nationalities when applying for a visa. Not only certain nationalities discriminated, for example, male individuals from certain nationalities when applying for a visa to stay in the Netherlands. They discriminated people with a second surname, which is not common in the Netherlands. It's actually forbidden. So you must then be from, another country, or people from living in a low-income neighborhood, or people with a dual nationality in attributing child welfare subsidies. So that you see how when these stories become more and more public, how the trust also that the citizens, if they had any on the state, declines rapidly. And third, there is another type of problem. The list actually could continue, but I, like Emiliana, I also like to think in threes. And that's probably the reason why we co-author, I don't know. But so the problem of algorithmic personalization, which is what, that's the reason why our life is so convenient online. Because, if we have geolocation on, then we are given the right recommendation for restaurants if we are in Berlin. So if they know that I like Mexican food, then they might actually serve me that type of recommendation, right? Or simply it's how, when we talk about then exposure to opinions of political nature on social media, I am served content that is in line with my desires and interests. So therefore, my worldview, as it is formed also by social media or through social media and exposure to content there, then is of a certain type only. So you have homophily, you have polarization, and all that comes with it. I mean, the next probably word there would be populism, or at least some people have tried to establish this correlation. So, but this is all about liberal democracy. But about these problems, how do we see them in action when we look at recent cases of social movements? I want to mention two. This is Derek Ingram, a Black Lives Matter activist from New York, who has been arrested for alleged assault. How? Actually, because the New York police used facial recognition technology and matched basically the pictures of his face taken by police cameras with pictures that were published on Instagram by the activist himself. Luckily, the fact that this became known, and unfortunately, a lot of this technology discriminates against people of darker complexion. The New York police banned the use of this type of technology, at least temporarily, but also IBM, for example, stopped developing temporarily facial recognition technology for consumer purposes, precisely because of its racism, or these racism allegations, let's call them. I mean, there's a lot of research that proves actually they're not just simply allegations. There is something there, there's a big problem. But this might happen to social movements today, to activists today, if they take the streets and protest. Now, you might think also, well, okay, but I'm white, I'm rich, and I live in a democratic country. So I want to protest for women's rights in Iran on the main square in Amsterdam. Yeah, but you are identified anyway. So it could be that the next time you enter Iran for, again, this is a privileged situation, right? So you're not going to be arrested because you're not even a citizen. So you are already in a completely different level of privilege compared to most of the people who would then be in that protest. But still, you might not be able to get a tourist visa next time. I mean, this is just to say this is clearly not where the problem lies, but it's to sort of counter the argument that usually pop up, which is like, oh, but I have nothing to hide, and I have, I live in a democratic state. Plus, we also know that democratic states might also verge into less democratic attitudes. Think, for example, about Turkey. So data that is collected today stays around and can say a lot about you in the future as well. So none of this. So when you have data around, essentially, it's not resilient to time what is done with this data. Or, the dynamics associated with it can change. And then another story that you might remember, this was also in the news. So this is, I don't actually remember, it's from the Wall Street Journal. So it's just a screenshot of a news item. You might remember that Hong Kong protests in 2019, where, so this was, these were pro-democracy protests. And in particular, people were trying to protest an extradition bill that would allow China to export suspect criminals, also for political, freedom of expression, let's say, related crimes, to China for trial. And as you can imagine, the protesters didn't like that, which is the reason why then they were carrying an umbrella to hide their face, because then defending your identity in such an authoritarian state becomes of fundamental importance. But in this particular picture, it's not very, very clear here, but they're actually they're taking down a lamppost. Why a lamppost? Because this smart lamppost, of which we have many in our cities, by the way, and they are not marked as such because the regulation allows basically the existence of this without in public space under certain conditions. So they're not allowed in a supermarket, but they will be allowed in the main square or at the station. At least this is by European legislation, but things are also changing. In any case, so these lampposts that look like relatively innocent lampposts with a camera, they were said to have embedded also these facial recognition capabilities. And that you can imagine what I told you earlier, basically taking the streets with your open passport on your forehead means basically denouncing yourself as a potential criminal in such a context. So you can see that it might be that people are also protesting for something completely different, like Black Lives Matter. In that case, the protest was not about racism in technology or algorithmic racism. In Hong Kong, the protest was not about surveillance. But we live in such a technological context so that we are not able, whatever we are mobilizing for, whatever we stand for, to ignore what the technological environment does to us as social movements. Well, in 1997, there was this great book, an edited collection by David Mayer and Sidney Taro, that was called The Social Movement Society. And I just put, like the kind of book description. So it was, the idea was to consider the ways in which the social movement as a form of collective action has changed as a political form, but also the ways in which it continues to change the societies in which it is prevalent. So this comes out of the tradition of new social movements. So the wave of movements in the 60s that took, well, actually also helped to establish the discipline of social movement studies, because before that, social movements were not present in society at such a scale. And, this prompted David and I and Christina, we found in Christina an enthusiastic partner in crime here, to try to ask ourselves, okay, if we were, without having the ambition to be like these great scholars, but if we are to reimagine this book today, what sort of exercise will we do? And then I put some pictures for you. They don't really see them probably very well, but these are just some recent movement that appear. So the first is the Fridays for Future, anyway, climate, pro-climate or against climate change protest. The second one is the protest in the US when the Supreme Court tried to ban abortion rights. And the third one, I don't remember now. Something anyway quite widespread and important of the recent years. Sorry. Whatever, I did it yesterday, I already forgot. Anyway, there's a lot of movements. That's what I want to say. But there's also a big question mark. How can we rethink about the social movement society today? What will we be able to tell about social movement society today in light of these technological transformations? And I put 2023 because that's where we are now. But, I also want to look into 2035 and see what, whether we can even predict anything there. Now, for us, it was quite important. There was a piece that it's not very long, right? But very, very important piece that Christina wrote with Kevin Gillian called Navigating the Technology Media Movement Complex. That for some reason didn't receive, I think, the attention that it deserves, because he was really trying to do essentially what I'm talking about here. And Christina and her colleague call for this. They basically said we need to have better integration of the different intellectual traditions that are currently focused on the same set of empirical phenomena, which here I translate into, for convenient reasons, critical data studies and social movements. So both, to some extent, looking at the nexus technology media movement, and I add data and automation and all of that. Technology innovation continues so much that there's always a word to add next to it. But also they said is, we have to identify in what way there's a distinct break from the past. And it's what they call, we are in need of a field definition operation. And sorry for, giving us it's much better written. And, there are many other points so I encourage you to have a look at it. But for us, this was what also made us, gave us the encouragement of thinking along those lines. And what Davide and I then started thinking about is whether technological transformation, but also the transformation that in part, on account of technology, and here I also, look at Christina's and her work. So also forms of democratic innovations, they might require an updating, maybe, or definitely an expanding of the vocabulary of social movement studies. But in what way? This is really what we would like to know. So what we propose in an article that eventually is going to see the light. but it's just technology keeps always changing. Like there's always something to add. So David and I have been working, and actually Emiliano this morning kindly referred to our work on data activism and the contentious politics of data. So I'm going to leave it a little bit at that, but I had the chance from 2014 to think a lot about data activism, also thanks to European funding. So there were a lot of us looking at many, many different aspects of what we call data activism. But then we were not satisfied anymore with the sort of straight jacket of data activism, because it did the trick of thinking about the relation between citizenship and data. But then we also wanted to know what there is in this story for, social movements more in general. And then we started thinking, and it's also probably a bit more provocative than really, a proper theoretical contribution. We want to hint at what we call the datafied movement. So datafied movements, in a way, it's a sort of socio-cultural, historical configuration of social movements today. So we're not talking about a specific movement here of people that, like in data activism, deal with data, or some of the examples that you heard from Emiliano this morning. We are talking about the fact that there's such a large change of context that all movements become, to some extent, knowingly or not, deliberately or not, datafied. And what does this do to movement? That's something we would like to know. Precisely because we live through this massive paradigm shift that affects, the state, citizens, and also political expression, political participation, and mobilization. How does the datafied movement then look like, and what tools do we have to understand them? And we would like to go beyond an instrumental approach here, and that's something that both of them over there, both Emiliano and Cristina, had also written about. So I'm also going to try to go quite quickly through this slide. But the fact that social movement studies, to some extent, well, for most of its existence, has relied on a very sort of instrumental approach to technology and media. So without much looking at how social media have appropriated or used, leveraged media, but not really, how media in a way have changed movements. Oversimplifying here. So what we would like to look, trying to go beyond the instrumental approach, is at the material and symbolic dimensions of datification and automation on and off social movements. So both of this type of influence towards a systematic engagement with how datification and automation impact movements at large. So movements, just for the fact that they exist in 2013, when they have to operate through platforms, when they do take the streets and they find facial recognition cameras, where the people probably build their worldview also through interaction with ChatGPT and similar tools. So just a practical definition here. Probably I should have put this slide earlier, but we also often collide this type of phenomena. These are not really proper definitions, but it's just a kind of operationalized definition. So we talk about digitalization to look at, talk about the digitalization of something, where it is intentional, where it is instrumental. So it's the intentional adoption of, or transformation, or modification in a way of certain dynamics from analog to digital. But then we talk about the datification in a way that is actually not really intentional, not necessarily or always intentional. So datification is something that we also live through because it is pervasive, because we are datafied as citizens, because we are datafied as human beings, and we cannot really avoid it. In a way, it is the distinction between, in the good old days, do you have a mobile or not? Can you actually today exist without a mobile? In the country where I live, it's hardly possible, because I need to have my digital identity to, to get access to healthcare. So it's very practical, so I don't have the luxury. I did try, for example, even with the vaccination certificate, to just carry around a piece of paper. And then it didn't work for most of the time, because even the cameras that were supposed to read the QR codes were optimized for the light of a screen. So I wasn't able to enter the gym, for example. So this is just a small anecdotal example of how datification, yes, is to some extent, to large extent, unavoidable. And then automation, which is, something that has already existed for a long time, but now it's much more visible with the pervasive nature of also consumer large language models and other form of intelligence systems in society. This really impinges more and more on citizen agency and citizen sovereignty. And then I left, I put some like ... because suspension marks, because there's so much more that I'm still thinking about that I haven't even grasped myself. How do I spend a lot of time thinking about this? And also, technology moves so fast that by the time you have finished writing something, there is already the next big change ahead. So what we would like to do here is to rethink social movements beyond digital activism and beyond data activism. So, even a movement that is not digital, but lives in a society in 2023 is affected by this. So, and what does it mean? So I would like to propose 5 conceptual operations. Now, they're in the making, and they are an attempt to rethink the toolbox of social movement studies. That's why there is the toolbox, but they're in the making. So probably the labels are also not very good, and probably you have a much better idea. If you have better ideas, thank you very much, because you're revising the article. And Christina is going to kill me if I don't send it like tomorrow. So for good reasons. So if you have, some good suggestion list, I can justify our delay, because the article, thanks to you, becomes so much better. So the 5 conceptual operations, I'm quickly moving to an end, are these ones that we would like to propose. So the first is the rereading of our core notion of social movement studies, which is the idea of action repertoire. The second is of political opportunities. The third is meaning making, sense making. The third is group making. And the fifth is collective identities. They're in no particular order, because there's no like it's a chicken egg question. What comes first, identity or political opportunity? Let's leave that aside for now. So I have a slide per each of one of them, and probably, well, let's see, also some examples. But if you have better examples, I'm also looking for those. So first, data-enabled repertoires. So how can we think about action repertoires in the age of automation and datification? So data, we observe that also very much with data activism, which explicitly per definition works on data issues, but they become at the same time a tool for mobilization and claim making, but also an object of contention in its own right. But then when you, for example, use data, so there's also a lot of beyond data activism, there's a lot of other movements that want to use data-fied techniques, if you want, or repertoires, tactics, and strategies to mobilize. And what happens when they want to do that? Very often they don't have the skills, very often they don't have enough knowledge. So what we see is that as a byproduct of that, we have novel skill-based partnerships and very interesting, unusual coalition. But we also see that under the pressure of datification and digitalization and automation, the repertoire in itself is adapted. As we know from social movement studies, the repertoire comes back. It means it's an incremental, list, right? So there's some classics like a demonstration, an occupation, a campaign, but there's also marginal innovation, marginal in the sense like always building on something that already exists. I'll give you a very concrete example. A few years ago, I was part of a series of workshops by Greenpeace Netherlands, which is actually where Greenpeace was born, which is very active. But Greenpeace Netherlands, I've had, as if you know, Greenpeace, one of the main elements in the action repertoires is occupations. So squatting is taking possession temporarily of, for example, typical in the Netherlands, the Shell headquarters. So fossil fuel company, Dutch company, well, not only Dutch, but with headquarters in the Netherlands. So very easy to sort of target. Now, you probably also know that they use volunteers. So they have very small, like minimal skeleton of staff members, but the people who go and know the occupations, they are volunteers. So you also want as an organization to protect, to train and protect to the best of your possibilities, the people who go and take action, who know that they might get arrested, but you don't actually want that they get arrested. So they know about the risk, but they also try not to get arrested. So the question was by Greenpeace Netherlands the following. So I know the rules, said the organization, when I want to occupy the Shell headquarters. I know that by Dutch rules, if you enter the building, but then the police is sent to evict you, they whistle 3 times. At the 3rd whistle, you have to be out of the building. Otherwise, they will arrest you. So basically what Greenpeace typically does is they go in, they try to put a banner, you know, at the top or whatever. So they create media resonance and an impact, you know, in people's imaginary. But then by the third whistle, they also safely leave the premises. So they're not arrested. But then they said, we would really like to do more data and website, you know, digital stuff, but we have no clue how to do it safely. So if we want to squat a website, for example, what's the equivalent of the 3 whistle so that I can tell our volunteers that they can safely get out at that precise moment? So this is what these are the very practical questions that, you know, moving more towards data-enabled repertoires, classical organizations like Greenpeace Netherlands will have their own very established, very popular, very well-known and well, you know, trained, rehearsed repertoire of action that they have to deal with. And I really like this example because I still don't have actually an answer for them. But there were a series of workshops to exactly think about this. So what we notice is an attempt to adapt the repertoire, to translate the repertoire to a completely different technological environment. The same you can say with, you know, if you know that you're calling for a demonstration, you're inviting people to go to the public square in a democratic country, but then, you know, there is facial recognition technology implemented by the police. You may want to tell the people. So if you are a non-documented migrant taking the street, you know that you might still be exposed to risks, but the risk is far less if you don't create a mess, right? If you don't make yourself very, very visible and expose yourself to arrest, typically, I mean, it's not a given, but you're not singled out. But what if there is facial recognition technology and your name, well, you're basically identified on the spot as not allowed to be in the country? You understand also the risks that come with it. In fact, the last point about data-enabled repertoires is that what we observe is quite some loss of autonomy and control over certain dynamics when you go through, for example, platforms. Here, the examples could be many. I'm just listing things here and risks in this case, but also the risk of surveillance via, for example, certain technologies like facial recognition technology or proprietary data infrastructures, like social media platforms, for example. Second, we have temporarily called techno-social political opportunities, but probably is not the right word, but for a lack of a better word, you know, if you have suggestions, again, very welcome. So we know from the literature here, I didn't, you know, sorry, very nice colleagues who wrote about these things. You probably know who they are, otherwise ask me afterwards. There was no space for the references, but there's plenty of writing about political opportunity structure, but also various, you know, sort of different types of political opportunities, which are not just referring to the state, which are discursive political opportunities, mediation political opportunities. There's also writing about, you know, policy windows or all the structural factors that contribute to stir mobilization. So what we see is that there is also a new form of political opportunities, which we have temporarily called techno-social. Some examples are, for example, scandals related to data bridges, like there's been this scandal in the Netherlands I mentioned about child welfare benefits. There's been, I put here a picture of someone we might remember, Edward Snowden, already a decade ago, you know, revealed, well, leaked a number of documents from, you know, blanket data, blanket surveillance of citizens in the US, but also from those coming from outside. And then, you know, you can recognize here Capitol Hill and a demonstration to stop asking to stop mass spying. Now, as we know, this has never, unfortunately, contrary to what I had hypothesized back then, but it has never really scaled up to concern much more of a bunch of people in society. It's still a luxury type of activism. You have to have food on the table before caring about your privacy. But this is a good example of how, you know, of a techno-social political opportunity. Political opportunities also derive from using the same tech. So we do use, you know, Twitter, for example, across different countries. And this creates also a commonality and allows different movements to sort of copycat or just, you know, inspire each other. So there's also, in a way, some kind of positive twist there in the potential of techno-social political opportunities. And we also see a sort of, as a corollary of using the same technology platforms, a sort of transnationalization of opportunities in what we may call the platform society. Third, and this is the newest one, because this really has to do with the large language models, which have become, from the fall, really available to everyone as consumer technology. So they are right in our computer, they are in the computers of the students. They have to write essays for our courses, right? So we're also trying to make sense of that, and so on and so forth. Actually, it was in the Italian news yesterday, this interview with a very random guy who said, I became addicted to ChatGPT. My wife left me, I lost my job, and my life is miserable. But after talking to ChatGPT consistently, any other interaction with any other human being seemed irrelevant. Because basically it was like my thirst of knowledge, I'm paraphrasing this interview, was only satisfied by, interaction with someone, the chat function that knows it all. So, so it's probably this, we are still in this, early phases of technology adoption where these stories fly, right? But to give you a sense of where we can go in a way. So these interfaces play an increasingly important role in how we form our worldviews, but also our political opinions. And then we have a lot of problems with that, because without really, getting into many details, but like, algorithmic bias, training bias, also automation bias, which is the bias by which, I might know that that person is not that person. But if the computer tells me that the match is correct, I tend to believe the computer much more than I believe the human in the loop. So that's what is called automation bias. So what for me is very, very interesting is try to understand what role does this have, if any, for example, framing efforts by social movements. And this is, this is to be seen. And I'm quickly moving to an end. The quickly in Italian is never very quick. Apologies for that. Algorithmic group making. So how do you create a group? How do you start recognizing each other as part of the same struggle, which is actually collective identity, which is going to come up later. But when there is an increasingly role played by non-human mediators, like hashtags that create a discourse, that show an association between me and someone else in a completely remote part of the world, simply because we refer to the same discursive realm. Recommender systems by which, through personalization algorithms, we get served certain type of technology. And again, large language models, which is the buzzword of today anyway. So these non-human mediators actually play an increasingly role in group making. In the moment in which, well, the perfect example is Me Too, but you have many, many more when, there are organizations or social movement organizations or simply coalitions or groups that try to mobilize people, try to attract bystanders, to mobilize them. But then, they do so on social media where they only get exposed to a certain social graph. So you have what we can think, is algorithmic recruitment, because algorithms mediate recruitment, but also coalition building, which is based on or mediated by algorithm. The matchmaking is algorithmic based. And this is mediated by corporate platforms that actually operate as black boxes. So we have no clue how exactly this works. We can double guess it. We have done actually a very interesting attempt in Amsterdam to double guess it, developing software to understand how software works. But there's so much we still won't never understand, also because this type of mechanisms operate in the realm of language of machine learning. So their function is not even immediately apparent to their creators. Then we also see that there is an impact of this type of mechanisms on leadership. Emiliano already spoke at length about visibility. So I'm not going to say much about that, but it's also something that's concerned me, quite a great deal, for the same reason why Emiliano is concerned about that. And what we see is that, there's also other people like Paolo Gerbaudo who wrote about leadership as it is mediated by algorithms, for example. So that's also a specific type. He also has terminology for that, a specific type of social movement leader that was different from before, right? And we also notice a sort of an acceleration of the cycles of contention. Movements that spike and decrease also rapidly. Now, as we know very well, the movement is digital representation. There's much, much more out there. But the media do believe that it is digital representation. And they also contribute to create hypes and then demobilization. And finally, the issue of collective identity is probably the one that I have the most fun with, because like Christina, I also kind of be obsessed with this element in social movement activism. And so what we see is that visibility again and platform metrics affect identity formation. And what we notice is the rise of minimum common denominator building blocks, which allows for simultaneous multiple belongings, but also an exacerbated volatility because the belonging is relatively fragile, and also the exacerbation of a movement's internal diversity. This is not necessarily bad, right? I mean, movements can be diverse. There's plenty of examples of movements that were extremely diverse. Think, for example, about the global justice movement at the turn of the 90s, the 2000s. But at the same time, and here I quote one of the activists, I'm not sure, he said, that any of my Facebook friends, when Facebook was really still the main point of reference, would come out to support me if I am arrested and I end up in jail. So this is also an element, that comes with the volatility and the building blocks, which are a minimum common denominator. And also we notice quite some incoherence of identity, which again might not be very, very bad. Actually, my co-author David has written his entire PhD thesis on marketing and how marketing dynamics and the time of social media affect social movements. And he talked about, here the example is from him, Anonymous, for example, as a brand, essentially, which is flexible enough to travel across different, in these mechanisms across different contexts, strong enough, but also very volatile at the same time. And I'm really at the end. And so we're looking forward. Yeah, there's so much more work to do. I just put questions on the table, and there's probably also many other questions to be asked. Definitely, what I would like to try to do also with you is to try to future-proof the toolbox of social movement studies without discarding the past, because there's plenty of very, very interesting. So, for example, one of my favorite writers of all times when it comes to thinking about collective identity is someone who didn't even see the internet as we know it today, Alberto Melucci, because he died before the internet was the web 2.0. For example, yet, his thinking is fundamental to understand also the days of ChatGPT. But there's still work to do there, right? And can we even anticipate the effects of technological transformation instead of always trying to play catch up? This is, probably the $1 million question. The answer is probably not. But it would be very nice if we could at least have a little bit of tools to do that. And also, ultimately, how can we move beyond the trap of the ever newness of the social phenomenon, the fact that, there's always something. ChatGPT is the new thing. If we meet here next year, there's going to be another one, and you name it. And we always fall trap as also scholars, in part because we also have to market ourselves, but also because of the enthusiasm before trap into, this type of fascination that also blinds us to some extent, because not everything is inherently new. There's still a lot that is not, for which the tools of the past are very important. So that's it. Thank you very much. I want to shout out to the special issue that for which we collaborated with Christina and the awesome social movement studies. Soon on your desk, actually, in fact, most of the articles are out there, including Emiliano's article. So to be continued. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Stefania, for such a stimulating and fascinating talk. We're going to kick off the discussion with the help of Jakob Lino Jensen, who is here in Aarhus as an associate professor in media and journalism. He is in the School of Communication and Culture, and he is the director of Internet Studies here at Aarhus University. He's an expert in political participation online and methods for analyzing social media, among other things. So he is going to come up here and give some feedback and some more food for thought from his perspective, and then we'll open it up to all of you. And of course, all of you online, you're also very welcome to pose questions, and we will take those as well. So I'll hand over now to Jakob.
Thank you very much. And thank you for a fascinating talk, Stefania. You are one of the only persons in the world who speaks faster than me. So, and I love that. I'll try to speak maybe just as fast because I have 5 pages of notes and a lot of things to discuss, and I forgot my reading glasses, so we will see how it goes. But you cover a variety of topics, and I think that we are both, I think this concept of being a political sociologist, I think that's what best describes me, because I'm a political scientist by training. I've worked in media studies for but with a perspective on political participation online, social movements, activism as well. And recently I've been very involved in research on the algorithms and where the platform take us. I do think that there are several issues. I will try to be a little bit schematic. Some of the questions you raise in the beginning, and then move to some of the implications for democracy. You're absolutely right that this datafication and automation process is running really fast, also too fast for us to cover sufficiently. You talk about this face recognition and biometrics technologies. And I do think that these kinds of technologies, they raise different questions. First of all, and that's what I'm really occupied at the moment. I do think that Emiliano touched it a little bit in the morning in his brilliant talk as well, namely the ownership of own data. Because I'm not a Marxist, but in my book, The Medieval Internet, I've proposed that the tech giants act as medieval feudal lords. They don't enslave us by our works anymore, but by our data. They own our data and they use them for their own good. And I think data ownership and data justice is one of the burning questions. And I know, Emiliano, that you're really occupied with this important issues at your center in Cardiff. So I think data justice, data ownership is one of the issues. And contrary to earlier, as you also talk about, Stefania, this is not only about what you produce on the internet, what you write, your product, your intellectual product. It's also about your own face, as we saw in your brilliant example. And it's about your DNA. Who has the ownership to your DNA code? I mean, the Danish government recently, 3 or 4 years ago, gave away 3 million Danish CPR numbers to the Chinese. It's a scandal. It's probably one of the, and we have had a lot of scandals in Denmark recent years of misuse of power, especially by the government. This is an enormous scandal, because what are the Chinese going to use them for? The DNA, I mean, is it private property? We never really defined that. There's a human genome project trying to take this into the public domain. Face recognition is one of them. Who owns your face? Christina, you had another example of the Google knowledge panels. They had these knowledge panels about you. I don't know about you, but I've as well tried 3 times to claim my own knowledge panel. I've even sent in my passport, whatever they're going to use it for. And I haven't been successful yet either. And they misspell my name and my title, and they claim I'm still at the School of Media and Journalism, and all of this crap. So this is also about the ability and the right to define truth. I also do think that this is very, very much, as we discussed in the morning, a question about visibility, because visibility is intrinsically linked to power. The medieval kings, the Renaissance kings, they made great spectacles like Versailles or the big tournaments in order to show their power. And in a more democratic society, visibility is more equally distributed among citizens. We are used to think that in the public sphere, everybody can see everybody. But these algorithmic technologies, they install new regimes and new stratifications and regimes of visibility and invisibility, as Tine Booker touched upon in her book and her work about Who Wants to Be on Top, the threat of algorithmic invisibility, because everybody wants to be visible. Earlier, it was really hard to get visible. Now, sometimes it's rather a matter of becoming invisible for the tech giants. The thought about that you cannot live without a phone, as you remarked in your talk, that scares me, because you're absolutely right. And this phone is a massive tool of surveillance. I don't even want to think about what they store about me or about all of you. among other things, I'm a Foucauldian. Michel Foucault destroyed my sense of reality, so it became more kind of balanced and nuanced. But I'm also quite suspicious of things, and I have been very focused on this concept of the panopticon. But these technologies are not a panopticon, but as I myself have suggested earlier, maybe an omnopticon. Everybody watches everybody. But contrary to the tower, we don't even know who is watching us and when and who they are. In Foucault's famous panopticon example, you know that the guards were watching you, but now we don't know who is watching us. So these are some of the surveillance aspects. You also, of course, touched upon democracy and this regime of knowledge machines. I also, we already discussed the Google Knowledge Panels and other similar examples of this technology. But the big problem of this is the proprietary aspects versus the open source movement. The internet was meant to be free. It was meant to be open source. It was seen as a common good. But just as the real tragedy of the commons described very well in the literature within political economy, this has also become a tragedy of the commons because the common has been siloized, it has been commodified, it has been datafied, and the tech giants really strive to take this into their domains. We call this the platform economy. Machines, and that'll take me over to the discussion of democracy. I do think that the knowledge machine raises two very important questions. And for a wannabe philosopher, as me, I studied history of ideas for 1 year. This is a matter of epistemology as well as ontology, because the epistemology is, of course, about how do these machines operate and how do we use them in seeing the world. But the knowledge machines, as you call them, that's a good word, also define the world. They define the truth. They define how Christina and me are seen in Google Knowledge Panels. They define right and wrong. And I don't even want to mention the fake news debate here and the struggle for defining the truth. The COVID is one example, the Ukraine-Russia situation, the Russian invasion of Ukraine is another example about how to define the truth. I mean, all of us are probably in favor of Ukraine, but we don't even know whether this information we get are true or not. This is also a question about infrastructures. And this is one of the questions I want to raise to you, Stefania. What is exactly in your terminology the difference between an infrastructure and a platform? Because that's something we discuss, and now you laugh, and I could do that as well, because that's one of the great questions. I mean, Plantin is, of course, one of the scholars discussing this to some length about the difference between an infrastructure and a platform, because we all agree infrastructures, that's like water structures, that's like roads, that's supposed to be a public good. But what about the platforms defining our knowledge? It's also a question about political economy, and I could talk much more, but I will. My last points will be about the future of democracy. Where substantial amount of the public sphere is mediated by tech giants. That's one of my own research topics, how Facebook, Twitter, Instagram mediate the public sphere, how they regulate, how they censor, how they curate content and define what we see. We all know that in our Instagram, Facebook feed, whatever, we only see between 1/5 and 1/6 of the content made available by our friends. We have tested that in our research group, and that's about what we can grasp, and other scholars have come to the same conclusion. What about all that is made invisible? I touched upon that, but the last democratic aspect you touched upon is personalization of information, and that leads, of course, to polarization. If you believe in witches or poltergeist, online you can get pure confirmation that they do exist. You can get confirmed in the worst possible lies. And if any of you have seen the brilliant film The Social Dilemma, you can see how a normal guy is turned into a radical right-wing extremist just by the tools of social media. and that'll be my last point here, and maybe also an invitation for discussion, because traditionally, I very much agree that many, including myself, have had an instrumental view on these topics. Instrumental in the sense that we have been very focused on media and the consequences of media. Traditions, because also come from political science. And political scientists, they fall into another trap. They see everything by traditional understandings of politics. Try to collaborate with political science in this department several times. And every time they say, well, we have already somebody understanding media. And they are great. I mean, I totally respect it. There are so many great colleagues there, and the research is absolutely world-class. But political scientists in general, they don't understand media because they haven't read the McLuhan. And McLuhan is the gateway to understanding media. If anybody is in doubt, he has made a book called Understanding Media, among other of his books. And then the famous one, The Medium is a Message, that had the mistake. So it was called The Medium is a Message. And Luhmann famously said, it doesn't matter. It's the same message. The medium is the message and the medium is a message. And that's actually true. And that's back to the infrastructure and platform discussions. Media are important for our understanding of the world. But I think both those views, and that would be my provocation here, are reductionist. I do believe we want to move in between, because we cannot see this only as a matter of media. Oh, now I'm called by journalists almost every month now. There's a new social medium, and what do you have to say about that? And I say, but it's more or less the same. I mean, we have had TikTok is really something very, very problematic. That's another discussion. But still, there are no really difference in these social media. I mean, they have different focuses, different ways of working, but the logics are some kind of the same. So we are not to discuss the media in themselves as we are not to discuss politics by tools and concepts that are not necessarily fit for discussing the actual state of the world. That we are going to study the hybrid media system. Emiliano and also Andrew Chadwick have suggested. These are hybrid phenomena, and we have seen in your great examples of activism, it's impossible to foresee how things develop. We should expect the unexpected, and there's a lot to do research about.
Much, Jakob. I'm going to hand over to Stefania to either respond to that or incorporate the response to taking some questions from the floor and from the people who are putting their questions online. So thank you again. Thank you so much, Jakob, for that very stimulating discussion. Really very much appreciated.
That's it. Yeah. Okay.
Okay, te doy esto.
Thank you so much. Jakob is another of the people that I've learned a lot from over the years, and we meet sometimes in conferences, and it's always very stimulating. So in any case, to be continued also later, but because there was a lot that resonates with, what several of us have been thinking about. So thank you for that. Also, thank you for the reference to the DNA, which is something that I actually only started looking at a while ago, and then I dropped it because it was honestly a bit too scary to even grapple with. And then I decided I just focus on, on the stuff that is more relevant for political participation. But, DNA is also political. It's really, it's our identity, it's our deep self, without even, distinguishing between what is political participation, what is just human existence. And what indeed I'm very, very scared about is this ability to, and the right to define truth, as you mentioned it, as you put it. And the fact that, like with the example of the Google Knowledge Panels, it's very hard to seek redress. It's very hard to correct, but also it's very hard to disentangle essentially what is going on there. And let alone to, of course, understand, try to figure out what exactly, to establish what is truth and what is not truth, which is probably anyway beyond the ability of one single human being. We are always very situated and stuff like that. But yeah, essentially we are looking into a system which is vertically integrated, because I mean, we have been as a society worried about antitrust regulation for a long time, but paradoxically, the knowledge economy is not has not yet been sort of the subject of concerns. I mean, to some extent, yes, but only to some extent, subject of concern of antitrust regulation, and antitrust regulations anyway, not enough to disentangle basically this extremely ramified power in establishing, defining the truth, while at the same time also owning the infrastructure, owning the plumbing, essentially, that delivers the truth to us. I like very much the idea of the fact that we don't even know who is watching us, which is not only, I mean, the fact that we don't know who is watching us in this specific point in time, but we also do not know, or it's impossible to predict what is going to be done with that knowledge about us in the future and by whom. I mean, think about, for example, encryption. So security agencies collect a variety of encrypted data in the certainty, not just the hope, that might be something there that we can break, if not today, tomorrow. Because with quantum computing, the speed at which basically you can break encryption is unheard of. And this is just an example to, again, bring back the problem of time into thinking about all of this. We might be shielded, we might be protected, we might be secured in this specific moment in time, in this specific place. But once you have the data can be used in many different manners. And just to get into more examples of why we should worry about this, even a country like Germany, which has in Europe probably one of the highest sense of privacy, let's say, or in a way, awareness as a society of certain risks and, certain questions. There was an app called the Lucas app, which was the contact tracing application that the state asked the citizens to install on their phones. And, everyone that I actually know, including the most privacy concerned, actually had it. And it would tell you when, in the peak of the pandemics, when you would come across someone who was positive, that would, tested positive. So that you would also, basically not become a hazard to more people, but, whatever, test yourself and stuff like that, or simply don't go, don't be social for a while, whatever that is. So, but technology, pretty innocent, if you want to present it as such, and serve to the citizens as such. The citizens were promised, install it, it's going to only be used for the purpose of curbing the social cost of the pandemic. Not even 1 year later, I believe, there was a scandal, because it turned out that these data, once they were collected, they were also used by security forces to supposedly track down crime. Crime can be defined in many different manners. Crimes of opinion are probably not very common in Germany, but there's been also there several cases in the past of misinterpretation, of misidentification that led activists to serve years in jail, activists that were actually completely innocent. So, again, like it can go in many different manners, and most of them, unfortunately, something that we really have to worry about. And Foucault, in that sense, also in thinking about what does this to the creation subjectivity, it's very important to understand what we're living through. And the question, the difference between infrastructure and platform is something that I also, it's a political economy question, but it's also, I feel, a disciplinary question. For example, I live in a department. I have awesome colleagues who have written extensively on the platform economy, the platform society, actually, which is, from also the point of view of political economy. I rarely use actually the notion of platform, simply because I've been obsessed since I can remember with the notion of infrastructure. Why do I like infrastructure? Because they are like scaffoldings. We rarely notice them. They are what allows us to be here, because I took public transport. Well, I flew, but it's still more public than a car. very bad anyway. But we are using public infrastructure like this building to gather here today. But we take it for granted. We only notice it because it breaks, and it does break often. So for me, the idea, and I also like very much that was also my PhD, and I've been following this obsession throughout my work over the last few years anyway, where, I look at how people make sense of infrastructure. And I really like this, so it's, if you want, for me, it is more like on ones of disciplinary language, but also what I want to highlight by using a certain term over another one. In fact, a lot of the platforms are also infrastructure. But for me, using infrastructure serves the purpose of doing a certain type of ontological exercise. And I'm not sure it answered your question. It could be debated over drinks for probably 3 days. And I'm sure I will learn a lot also from you in that sense. And then reductionism, that we do tend to see things as media, but also we tend to fall trap into this, what I call the newness, right? So, now there is TikTok, so we all have to worry about TikTok, and there's good reasons to worry about TikTok, but then there's also fundamentally some dynamics that come back and back again, right? And for which, the good old theory also is extremely useful. And definitely the hybridity, and some other people here in the room are much more entitled to me about talking about hybridity. I refrained from putting it there because I've never done research on that specifically, but it is definitely something to take into account when we look at this phenomenon, because no one lives in isolation, and no one can, whatever their realm of action, can stay shy of, the simultaneous engagement on very multiple fronts. Each of them collecting data, each of them doing different things with our data. I'm not sure I actually answer your questions, but thank you very much, and to be continued.